By Govanen. Welcome to Tolkien Lore Channel. I'm the Tolkien Geek, and in this video I want to explore some aspects of Aragorn's character and his history that are actually rooted very deeply in the Silmarillion. I'm not talking about just the fact that he's descended from some major characters in the Silmarillion, but the fact that in particular his life in some ways parallels rather interestingly two very important characters, namely Beren and Turin. So let's take a look at that. So the first parallel with Beren's life is kind of obvious. His love affair with Arwen and Domiel is very, very heavily parallel to Beren and Lúthien's own love story. So, and one of the interesting aspects of this too is the fact that when he meets Arwen for the first time, he actually calls out to her as Tenuviel, which is what Beren calls Lúthien when he first meets her, and he does it because he's kind of already thinking in that frame of mind, and he sees Arwen and he's thinking, like many other people do, that she is very reminiscent of Lúthien because she is kind of considered Lúthien-esque in her beauty, and so he calls her Tenuviel, and she actually tells him, well, actually a lot of people, call me that, and I'm actually, descended from her, and they find out that they're kin for that reason, distant though they be. But at any rate, there's, very heavy parallels there to the point that it's, almost ridiculous. And another interesting aspect of this is this puts Elrond in the category of being Thingol, who in the Silmarillion is very much opposed to the idea of Lúthien marrying Beren. And in the Lord of the Rings, in the appendices, what we learn about, Elrond's whole attitude towards Aragorn's love for Arwen is he's not quite as mean as Thingol for sure, because he doesn't say no, never under any circumstances, and by the way, if you really want her, you have to go on a quest that'll get you killed, which is basically what Thingol does. In Elrond's case, what he says is, this is really going to hurt me, and for that reason, and because I don't want Arwen to just marry any old person, you have to be king of Gondor and Arnor before I'm going to give, her in marriage to you. So there is a parallel there as well, because Aragorn and Beren both have to go and accomplish something really important to get their love interest, but it's not quite exactly parallel, because here Elrond isn't trying to get him killed like Thingol was trying to get Beren. So there's our first really big parallel. And before I get into Turin, I want to try to explore most of Beren's. And before I go any further, I also wanted to mention, because I've got, my whole Silmarillion synopsis series, I will link to that playlist so you can go and find the videos on, the Beren and Lúthien and the Turin Turambar chapters, so you can get a good idea of their stories if you really want to get background before getting too deep into this. Two other aspects that make Aragorn's story very similar to Beren's is he has the Ring of Barahir. Now, we don't really see much of it in the book because it doesn't really become hugely significant, but Aragorn being, the direct descendant of Beren through the lines of the kings of Númenor, ends up inheriting the Ring of Barahir as well as the Sword of Elendil and all this other stuff. So he, like, Beren, has the Ring of Barahir. Unlike Beren, he never really uses it for, to gain the, aid of some great elf king or anything like that. That never becomes hugely relevant. But it is interesting that he also has the ring, of course. And the final aspect, really, of Beren's story that's similar is that, like Beren, his father is killed. In Aragorn's case, it's not when he's, well, in Aragorn's case, it's not when he's already an adult and he's not betrayed. His father is actually out fighting orcs and trolls and things and just gets killed when Aragorn is very young. And so he ends up being fostered in Rivendell, which is what most of the line of the kings of Arnor were ever since the kingdom itself kind of fell into ruin, partially just because it's the safest place to be, and because Elrond is distantly related to all of them, so he has an interest in, making sure they survive. Plus, he has foresight and sees that they're going to have an important role. So those are the main aspects in which he parallels Beren's story, and you could go into a lot of detail, I guess, in really exploring the Beren Luthien aspect, but I don't want to harp on that too much because if I do that, it'll be a video unto itself. And I'm going to eventually do a video on the Aragorn and Arwen section of the appendices anyway, so that'll be for a later time. Now let's look at his parallels to Turin. So interestingly enough, some of the parallels with Turin's life are somewhat the same as some of the parallels with Beren's, and in one of those ways, Elrond is again kind of the Thingol figure because, like Turin, who was fostered by Thingol, Aragorn is fostered by Elrond. Now it's a very different situation because obviously Thingol is fostered because Thingol is kind of trying to be nice because he's Beren's kinsman, and obviously Turin doesn't end up going after his daughter because she's already claimed. But it is rather interesting that in both scenarios, Elrond is playing the Thingol character. So it's just really fascinating to see how that all weaves in, and we'll see a little bit more of that pop up. Another similar aspect to Beren's story is the fact that Turin loses his father at a very young age. Well, that's not, the fact that he loses him at a young age is not like Beren, it's more like Aragorn. But it's weird because he doesn't actually die. Hurin is not killed, he's basically just held captive, but effectively Turin is an orphan. And so, in that way, he's kind of like a weird in-between step. There's three different modes of kind of the same thing. All three of them lose their fathers just in different ways and at different times of their lives. Aragorn loses his father when he's just a baby. Turin's, I think, 9 years old when his father's captured, and then Beren, of course, is a full-grown man with his own, he can live on his own just fine. So there's a lot of that going on, and it's just interesting to see how all three of them end up having a lot of their lives impacted by that too, because kind of going back to Beren, whenever he loses his father, that's when he goes to Doriath and meets Luthien. Turin goes to Doriath after his father is captured because his mother doesn't want him being basically treated really badly by all the evil men who move in. And Aragorn is more or less being fostered by Elrond for the same reason, to keep him safe. So, I mean, it's a lot of all this stuff plays into the same kinds of things in their lives that all ends up being in some way rooted in the loss of their father. But so that's one thing. But now let's look at some more Turin specific stuff. So one of the aspects that's very interesting about Turin, which is similar to Aragorn, is Turin for most of his story carries around a rather interesting sword, and it's not parallel to Narsil / Andúril because it's an heirloom, but they're both very significant swords in their own stories. In Turin's case, you do have the issue of the sword being kind of a bad sword, but interestingly enough, the story does use the term reforged. After he accidentally kills Beleg and then Gwyndor helps him get to Nargothrond, they say that in Nargothrond it's reforged. It was never broken, it just says that it was dull, but it does say that after they reforged it, it has a really interesting sheen to it on the edges and whatnot, which is similar to what it says about Narsil when it's reforged into Andúril. It kind of gleams as if it has, an inner light or a fire, hence the name Flame of the West, which is what Andúril means. So it's really interesting that both of them have kind of a shine. They're both reforged. They're both, I'm not sure exactly how famous Turin's sword would have been, but certainly Aragorn's is, and Turin's is not. It at least becomes famous because he even becomes known as the Mormagil, the Black Sword. I mean, it's like it becomes famous even if it never was famous before, just because of all the things he does with it. So they both have this, famous sword thing going on, and a lot of the sword plays into their destiny as well, because Turin ends up doing bad things with the sword and then finally ends up killing himself with it, and a lot of all that follows from when he accidentally kills Beleg with the sword. Aragorn's story is a lot happier in that way, of course, because he reforges the sword, carries it around, he is the heir of Elendil, and this is kind of part of his coming into his own in becoming the king of Gondor and Arnor and taking up, his rightful role as the heir of both, kings of Gondor and Arnor. A couple other interesting things about Turin that match up with Aragorn's story. He is very much sought out by the great enemy of the story. Morgoth is really interested in making sure he can keep an eye on Turin so that he can make sure that his curse on Húrin's family comes to fruition. Aragorn and everybody in his line is also sought out by Sauron, which is why they're all fostered by Elrond and Rivendell. Sauron doesn't know for sure that there is an heir of Isildur, but he definitely wants to make sure that if there is one, he can kill him. And of course, there's no curse involved, but both cases, they're still, very much a matter of interest to the great enemy of the story. And also, Aragorn, like Turin, becomes a very great captain and leader in a lot of different contexts. Turin, we don't ever see him explicitly in that role, whereas Aragorn, it's really kind of highlighted that he's a great leader. He leads, the men of Rohan. He leads, the Grey Company through the mountains and down to the river Anduin, where he takes the pirate ship, the Corsair ships, and he does all this stuff. And it's very explicit that he's a really good leader. Turin, we don't see that highlighted as explicitly, but if you pay attention, you can see it. He ends up as the leader basically everywhere he goes. And in another way, this is also parallel because, like Aragorn, he ends up, kind of going off on his own for a while and then serving other kingdoms that, he doesn't come from and that are not his own. Well, in a sense, Aragorn does serve a kingdom that's his own because he serves under Ecthelion, the steward of Gondor, before Denethor's time. Ecthelion is Denethor's father, and so in that sense, he's kind of like serving in his own kingdom, which is kind of ironic. But he also serves in Rohan, and this is kind of parallel to when Turin serves in Nargothrond. They both end up, just coming to these places and becoming very important figures. And the only real difference is that Turin, every time he starts to take any kind of an influential role anywhere he goes, he tends to make it go south. His advice leads to the downfall of Nargothrond. His hyperactivity in the woods of Brethil lead to Glaurung discovering that, oh wait, that must be Turin over there. I'm going to go wipe out those guys now. And so there's just always something bad following from him doing stuff. And that's mainly because Turin, unlike Aragorn, doesn't understand that discretion is often the better part of valor. Unlike Aragorn, this is kind of like a reverse parallel, Aragorn hides his identity very well. And he's, a very significant person everywhere he goes, but he keeps his, his true identity under wraps and he goes under a false name. Turin tries to do the same thing, but everything he does kind of reveals who he is, just because it's like once he became initially known and he starts using the black sword, it's like everywhere he goes, every time he uses the black sword or every time he uses the dragon helm, these are like markers of his identity. And so he starts getting really active in a place and it becomes obvious, oh, wait, there's Turin again. So Morgoth always kind of knows where he is because he can't, keep from using stuff. I mean, he'll put the dragon helm aside for a while, or he'll put the black sword aside for a while, but he always ends up taking them back up. Aragorn isn't quite that foolish. He's always good at keeping his identity hidden from everybody. And like Turin, he ends up having really big influence. He becomes one of the key advisors to Ecthelion in his time. He becomes a great leader in the kingdom of Rohan under Thingol, Theoden's father. He becomes very influential, just like Turin. He just uses his influence for good rather than, accidentally leading to the downfall of every, place he goes. One final aspect of Aragorn's life that's kind of like Turin's, and here it's a little bit weaker because you don't see it as much in the main story. Turin, of course, has his great friendship with Beleg, Beleg Strongbow, and their friendship is very key to the early parts of the story until he accidentally kills Beleg. Aragorn is also very good friends with some elves as well. We just don't see that as much in the main story because the elves he's really friends with are Elrond's sons, who are mostly off scene doing their own thing. But if you read the appendices, and even if you just really pay attention to the main story, you can tell Aragorn and Elrond's sons have a lot of things that they do in common. They both really like to kill orcs and, do that sort of thing, and they work together in a lot of ways. Aragorn will get news from them and that sort of thing. They don't have quite the same kind of friendship that Turin has with Beleg, but of course, Aragorn being raised in Rivendell, he's going to be friends with elves, and of course he is, he's known by almost all the major elf lords and whatnot of the time. Galadriel and Celeborn know who he is, and they're perfectly, good friends with him. And he's also friends with lots of other elves that we probably don't even know about. I mean, it's bound to happen. And the other interesting thing about that too is that in the Council of Elrond, actually, Elrond says that Turin is an elf friend, which is a really interesting point because Turin wreaks a lot of havoc, and you wouldn't necessarily think that somebody who brought about so much destruction would end up being called an elf friend, but he is. And of course, Aragorn, though I don't think we ever hear that title applied to him, certainly would have to fit in that category because obviously he saves Middle Earth from, the threat of Sauron, or helps to do so anyway. And he's like the last remnant of the line of the kings who are themselves descended from the same ancestor as Elrond, and so he has to be an elf friend, even though we never actually see him called that. But anyway, that's maybe the weakest aspect of this, but it's still, I think, significant that both individuals have very close ties to elves, if for very different reasons. Although in both cases, it is at least partially because they are fostered by an elf king. Well, Elrond's not an elf king, but he's about the closest thing. So those are some interesting ways in which Aragorn's life parallels that of Beren and also Turin. The interesting things about that are, you can look at the parallels and kind of see where Aragorn is kind of a recapitulation of Beren, but he's like a Turin made better. Like he fixes all the mistakes that Turin makes, which is interesting because he's descended from Beren, but not Turin. Not necessarily significant, but it's at least kind of interesting. So anyway, hope you enjoyed that video. If you can think of any other interesting parallels, I'd be interested to hear them in the comments below. Please do like and share the video around. If you want to follow me on Twitter, you can get some occasional Tolkien-related trivia questions. I'm on Twitter at JRRTLore. And of course, you can subscribe to the channel here. Don't forget to click that bell icon. You can support the channel here, and you can find 2 of my previous videos here. Until the next time, I'm the Tolkien Geek signing out for the Tolkien Lore channel. Namarie.